The winter light fell in fractured shards across the demolition site, a pale and brittle glow that made the dust in the air look like suspended ash. Workers moved slowly around the old townhouse block, their boots crunching over gravel, their voices muffled by scarves and the constant hum of the machinery that gnawed at brick and mortar. The year was 2023, but the building they were tearing apart felt like it belonged to another world entirely, a world where shadows lived long after their owners had vanished. And on that brittle morning, the first crack in the western brick wall appeared like an eyelid slowly opening after decades of forced slumber, unaware that what lay behind it had been sealed away since the final winter of the war. The foreman was the first to notice the fissure, a thin line spiraling across the red bricks with an almost deliberate grace. He raised a gloved hand, halting the machine operator, and stepped closer, his breath fogging in the cold air as he examined the strange discoloration spreading from the crack. It wasn't moisture. It wasn't mold. It looked almost like soot, embedded deep within the mortar, as if the wall itself had inhaled a fire long ago and never exhaled it. When he placed his palm against the bricks, he felt a faint difference in temperature, a ghost of warmth that made no sense on a freezing morning. The others gathered behind him, murmuring as the fissure widened with a soft but unmistakable groan. When the brick finally gave way, falling outward in a slow crumble, the workers expected to see rot or pipes, or perhaps an empty crawl space. Instead, something small and round rolled toward their boots, bumping lightly against the toe of one man's steel-toed shoe. It was a wooden bead, painted with faded stripes of red and blue. The colors were muted, but somehow still vivid enough to stand out against the gray dust. One of the younger workers bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hand before looking toward the foreman for explanation. The foreman had none. He only swallowed hard and directed the men to widen the opening in the wall with as much care as possible. They chipped away at the bricks until a hollow cavity revealed itself, packed not with debris, but with small objects, soft shapes, rigid pieces, rounded edges, fragments of color hidden beneath decades of silence. As they pulled away more bricks, daylight seeped inside and illuminated the space. There, untouched by time's usual cruelty, lay a collection of children's toys, a wooden spinning top with chipped gold paint, a cloth doll with button eyes, miniature tin soldiers lined up as though in formation, and a small leather ball, deflated, yet unmistakably placed with deliberate care. The workers stared at the scene in stunned silence, as if expecting someone small to reach in and snatch them back. One of the older workers whispered that he had heard stories about this block, about families who lived here during the war, about children who had vanished one night and were never seen again. Stories whispered by his grandmother when he was young enough to think ghosts were real, and old enough to sense that sometimes they were. The toys looked like they belonged to that time, their craftsmanship antiquated yet intimate, carrying fingerprints from a world that had collapsed under the weight of fear and soldiers' boots. But why were they here? Why were they sealed inside a wall? And why did they look as though they had been placed there gently, almost ceremonially, as if someone had wanted to preserve something innocent in the face of something monstrous? As the foreman reached inside to lift the cloth doll from its hidden cradle, a shiver ran through him that felt less like cold and more like a memory he did not own. He turned the doll over, noticing the hand-stitched initials on the fabric dress. The S. The thread was frayed, but the letters were still distinct. He felt the eyes of the workers on him, waiting for him to speak, to make sense of what suddenly felt like the opening of a crypt. He cleared his throat but said nothing, because the story behind these toys was older than any of them, and the truth had been buried behind that wall for reasons no one yet understood. The police were called, though even they seemed uncertain why. It wasn't a crime scene, not yet, but something about the atmosphere demanded official presence, as if the toys themselves were artifacts from a tragedy that had been waiting to surface. Officers arrived, their radios crackling in the cold, their boots leaving imprints in the dust. They examined the cavity, photographed the toys, catalogued every object with a precision that seemed to acknowledge the weight of history pressing against their spines. When one officer reached into the space and found a small notebook bound with twine, the mood shifted entirely. The notebook was fragile, its cover worn, its pages yellowed. A date was written in pencil on the first page, March 3rd, 1943. The officers exchanged glances. The year alone was enough to thicken the air, and when they opened the second page and found the shaky handwriting of a child, describing nights filled with sirens and footsteps on the stairs, hearts tightened. Nobody spoke for a long time. The silence felt like respect, or fear, or perhaps both. The workers stepped back, allowing the officers to carry the notebook to a safer place, away from the wind that had begun to rise with an almost intentional chill. As the investigation began to unfurl, journalists arrived with cameras and questions, their breath forming clouds of urgency as they tried to understand the implications of what had been found. The neighborhood stirred with old rumors, resurfacing like bones rising from thawed ground. People who had lived here for generations recalled stories their grandparents had whispered late at night about 3 children who had vanished in 1943. Their names had blurred over the decades, but parts of the tale remained sharp. The children were siblings, their parents were rumored to be involved in something forbidden, and their disappearance was never officially explained. Some said they had been taken by soldiers. Others believed they had been hidden by their parents to protect them from the war, only for tragedy to intervene. But no one ever imagined that the last trace of them would be toys sealed behind a brick wall, waiting 8 decades to be found. In the middle of the growing commotion, a historian arrived, her coat pulled tightly around her as she surveyed the scene with the solemnity of someone who had spent her life studying the ghosts of the past. She knelt beside the cavity, brushing dust gently off a small wooden horse. Her expression softened as she recognized the style, the type of toy common in Central Europe during the early 1940s. She spoke softly, almost to herself, explaining that toys like these were often handmade, crafted by parents or local artisans. They carried emotional significance, symbols of comfort, during times when comfort had become scarce. She speculated that whoever hid these toys might have done so in haste or desperation, or perhaps with the hope that one day the children would return to find them waiting. The idea hung in the air like frost, fragile and chilling. As she turned to the notebook on a nearby table, she paused, realizing that the handwriting inside might offer clues lost for 80 years. But deeper than that, she sensed an undercurrent of sorrow in the discovery, as though the building itself had been mourning something in silence. She wondered aloud why the wall had cracked now, in this particular year, when the structure had endured decades of winters without complaint. The workers glanced at each other, unsure whether the question was rhetorical or whether they were meant to entertain the idea that buildings, like people, might eventually reach a breaking point under the weight of their secrets. The historian's gloved fingers lingered on the cover of the notebook as she breathed a quiet observation, one that made several people shift uncomfortably. She said it was unusual for personal belongings to be hidden in structural walls, unless the person doing the hiding feared discovery. She suggested that this might have been an act of protection, someone trying to preserve the last pieces of the children's lives at a moment when everything was being taken from them. The officers exchanged uneasy looks, trying to reconcile the innocence of the toys with the ominous implication that they had been sealed away just before the children themselves disappeared. While the historian continued her examination, one of the workers took a slow step back from the group, turning his face toward the half-demolished building behind them. He stared at the cracked bricks, at the hollow eyes of broken windows, at the lingering sensation that the structure was more than a carcass of stone and timber. It had absorbed decades of echoes, whispers, unanswered cries, and now, with its walls crumbling, it seemed determined to exhale everything it had held tightly inside. The man rubbed his hands together, trying to dispel the chill creeping through him, but the cold he felt wasn't from the wind. Standing among the investigators and experts, he wondered whether anyone else sensed the strange stillness settling over the site, the way the air seemed to pulse with the quiet insistence of a memory resurfacing. He found his mind drifting to a question he couldn't shake. What would compel someone to hide toys in a wall, and what had happened to the small hands that once held them? As he wrestled with these thoughts, he glanced at the crowd gathering at the barricades, members of the public leaning in to get a glimpse of the unfolding mystery. He wondered what they felt as they watched: curiosity, sadness, fear, or perhaps enough connection to imagine their own childhood artifacts buried in some forgotten corner of time. Speaking of watching, if you are following this unfolding darkness with us, tell me, from where are you watching this video right now? The silence that follows your answer will echo through the shadows we're about to explore. As the day stretched toward afternoon, the police secured the site and began preparing to remove the section of the wall entirely. The toys were carefully documented and placed into evidence containers lined with acid-free paper. The historian requested permission to analyze them further, arguing that each object might hold clues, manufacturing details, personal markings, or signs of wear that could help identify the children who once owned them. The officers agreed, though they seemed wary of allowing anything to leave their custody. The toys felt less like artifacts and more like messages, reminders of a past that had refused to stay buried. Before leaving the site, the historian paused near the cracked wall, tracing the rough edges of the opening with her fingertips. She remarked quietly that some walls are built to hold weight, while others are built to hold secrets, and that sometimes those secrets demand to be released. Her words lingered long after she stepped away, settling into the dust like a subtle warning. The workers resumed their tasks, though with noticeably less enthusiasm, their movements slower, as though they feared disturbing something fragile and unseen. By the time the sun dipped toward the horizon, the building stood half dismantled, the discovery of the toys now an indelible stain on the day's memory. Officers continued to cordon off the area, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. The toys were gone, transported to a secure location, but the cavity in the wall remained, a hollow wound in the structure that seemed to breathe cold air. Every person who passed it felt an inexplicable urge to look inside, even though it now held nothing but darkness. Some said they felt watched. Others claimed they heard faint sounds, like a distant hum or a soft tapping on the remaining bricks. Whether these were tricks of the wind or remnants of old fears, no one dared to investigate further. The night arrived with a suddenness that felt unnatural, the sky turning from bruised purple to deep black as streetlights flickered on. With the site locked and the workers gone, The building sat alone in the quiet, its broken frame exposed to the chill, and though no one remained to hear it, the cold wind moving through its corridors carried a strange note, something between a sigh and a whisper, as though the structure itself mourned the children who had vanished 8 decades earlier. It mourned the toys they had left behind, the moments stolen from them, the echoes trapped in its walls. And somewhere inside that vast silence, something stirred ever so slightly, as if awakened by the sudden exposure of its long-guarded secret. If you want to keep hearing this story, drifting deeper into the shadows of the past with every breath, make sure you subscribe, so you never miss the darkness waiting beneath the next layer of brick and dust. By the following morning, the story had already spread across the city like an infection of curiosity and dread. The headlines were sharp, deliberate, designed to stir both fascination and unease. Toys from 1943 found in demolition site. Connection to wartime disappearances possible. Beneath those words, images of the cracked wall filled television screens and news feeds, showing the hollow cavity where time itself seemed to have paused. People gathered around cafe tables, around phones, around evening dinners, whispering theories as though the ghosts of those lost children had reached out through the decades to tap softly on their shoulders. At the police station, the small notebook found behind the bricks had been placed under protective glass. The pages, though yellowed and fragile, were surprisingly well preserved. The handwriting, uneven, hesitant, belonged to a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. The entries were short, written in pencil, and carried an unsettling mixture of innocence and fear. The first few pages described ordinary things: the smell of bread from the downstairs bakery, the sound of the radio crackling with the Prime Minister's voice, the way the mother hummed a tune while mending clothes by candlelight. But as the days progressed through early 1943, the tone darkened. Mentions of sirens appeared, of soldiers in the street, of whispers between adults when they thought the children were asleep. Then came a passage that made every investigator in the room pause. The entry read, "Mother said we might need to hide soon. She told us to pack something small, something we love, and be ready when she says the word." Below that line, the pencil mark stopped abruptly, as though the child had been interrupted mid-thought. The next page was blank, except for faint indentations from writing that had been erased with force, as though someone had tried to remove words that should never have existed. The historian who handled the notebook noted that the handwriting matched records of a girl named Lydia Sokolov, born in 1934, who had lived in that very building with her 2 younger brothers before they vanished in March 1943. The discovery of her name triggered a flood of old documents from archives long forgotten: wartime census records, evacuation lists, police reports written in the chaotic scrawl of an era defined by urgency. The Sokolov family's file was thin, just a few pages, but enough to confirm that Lydia, along with her brothers Emil and Anton, had indeed disappeared without a trace. Their parents were listed as deceased, but no date was given. The only note in the margins was a single phrase, written in German by an unknown hand: "Unter Beobachtung vor dem Abtransport," under observation before deportation. The historian sat alone with those words for a long time, letting their meaning settle like dust in her mind. It suggested that the family had been under surveillance, perhaps due to political suspicion, ethnicity, or even an act of defiance. But the phrasing also hinted at something more deliberate, that they were marked for removal, yet not immediately taken. That pause, that moment of suspension between danger and disappearance, might have been when the toys were hidden, a final act of a mother trying to protect her children's last fragments of normal life before everything was taken away. She closed the file and looked up at the map pinned on the wall of the investigation room. The neighborhood around the demolished building had once been part of a district heavily bombed during the war. Many of the houses had been rebuilt, their histories erased beneath concrete and glass. But the townhouse in question had survived, its brick walls scorched but standing, a relic amid renewal. It had seen the occupation, the liberation, the slow decades of silence that followed. And in that silence, it had kept its secret. Until the wall cracked. Outside the station, a light snow began to fall. It clung to the cobblestones, to the iron railings, to the memories that refused to fade. The historian wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck and stepped into the chill. She had arranged to meet an elderly resident named Herr Becker, who claimed to remember the Sokolov family. He lived just a few blocks away, in an apartment that smelled faintly of varnish and old paper. When she arrived, he greeted her at the door with a trembling hand, his pale eyes carrying the faint blue of faded sky. They sat across from each other in a dim room filled with ticking clocks and the muffled hum of a distant radio. When she mentioned the toys, his gaze fell to the floor. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a truth he had long suspected would one day resurface. "I was a boy," he said, his voice thin. 10, maybe 11. We played in the same courtyard. Lydia had a doll with buttons for eyes. One was missing. Emil carried a wooden horse everywhere, and little Anton had a ball he used to toss against the wall until his mother told him to stop. I can still hear the sound. He paused, swallowing hard. Then one day they were gone. No one said anything. No one asked. People were too afraid to ask questions in those days. The historian leaned forward. "Do you know what happened to them?" Becker shook his head. "No one knew for sure, but we heard things. That their father had been helping someone. Hiding people, perhaps, or passing messages. That's what my father said. Then one night, soldiers came. I remember the noise, the shouting. I remember seeing light in their window, like a flash, then darkness, and in the morning the room was empty. Curtains open, toys still on the table, but the family was gone." His voice faltered as if the memory itself burned. He closed his eyes, and the silence stretched between them, filled only by the slow ticking of one of his many clocks. "You know," he whispered. "After the war ended, some of us went back to that building. We found the door locked from the inside, but the upstairs rooms looked untouched, like the family had simply vanished in the middle of the night. It felt wrong, like the air was heavier there. I never went back after that." The historian thanked him and left, but as she stepped out into the snow-covered street, her thoughts wouldn't quiet. The image of the abandoned room, the half-packed toys, the sudden absence, it all aligned too perfectly with what they had found behind the wall. If the Sokolov children were taken, or hidden, or worse, who had sealed their toys in that cavity? The mother, the father, or someone else entirely, someone trying to erase the evidence of their existence? Every possible answer led to a deeper question, one that pulsed at the center of the mystery like a heartbeat buried under rubble. That night, back at her apartment, she spread the photographs of the toys across her desk. The cloth doll, the wooden horse, the tin soldiers. Each one had been cleaned gently, restored just enough to preserve without altering. Under the lamp's glow, they seemed almost alive, their shadows long and unsettling against the wall. As she studied them, she noticed something she hadn't before. Faint burn marks on the underside of the wooden horse, as if it had been near intense heat. She thought of Becker's words about the flash of light, about the night the family vanished. Fire, perhaps, or something worse. The air in the room grew colder as she stared at the toys, realizing they might not just be remnants of childhood, but witnesses. Unable to sleep, she opened the notebook again. The graphite letters shimmered faintly in the lamplight. She traced the last entry with her fingertip. Mother said we might need to hide soon. Something about the phrasing felt off. Why might? Why not will? It implied uncertainty, hesitation. It sounded like a child repeating something overheard, something not meant for her ears. She turned to the blank page again, squinting at the faint indentations left by the erased writing. She adjusted the angle of the lamp, letting the light fall obliquely across the paper, and suddenly the erased marks revealed themselves like bruises under skin. She could make out fragments of words. Behind the wall. Promise. No matter what happens. Her breath caught. She grabbed a pencil and gently shaded over the indentations, coaxing the hidden message to life. The full line emerged slowly, ghostly, but legible enough to send a chill through her chest. Mother said we'll be safe behind the wall. She promised. The historian sat frozen, the pencil still trembling in her hand. Safe behind the wall. The words echoed through the empty apartment, their meaning twisting with every repetition. The children had been hidden inside the wall. The toys weren't a memorial or an offering. They were a sign, perhaps left behind in the same place where the children themselves had been concealed. But if that were true, why had no remains been found? Why had the cavity contained only the toys, untouched, uncorrupted, unless there was more to the wall than anyone had realized? The next morning she returned to the demolition site before dawn, her breath rising in the cold air. The police had sealed the area, but she used her credentials to gain access. The building loomed against the gray sky, its windows like hollow eyes. She climbed over the caution tape and approached the wall, kneeling beside the cavity. The cold air that seeped from within still carried a strange heaviness, as though the space were more than empty. She shone her flashlight inside, tracing the uneven interior. At first, nothing appeared unusual. The toys had been removed, leaving only dust. But as she ran her hand along the bricks, she noticed something faint. A seam, almost imperceptible, deeper inside, suggesting a second layer of masonry behind the first. Her pulse quickened. She tapped it lightly. The sound that came back was not solid, hollow. She whispered to herself, "There's more." But before she could investigate further, a voice echoed from behind, an officer calling out for her to step away from the site. She straightened, forcing composure as he approached. He told her the wall was unstable, that demolition would continue once permits cleared. She nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. If there was another layer of bricks, perhaps the real secret still slept behind it, sealed away as tightly as the truth. That night, she made a decision. She would return after dark, when the site was empty. She told herself it was for research, for history, for truth. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something about the discovery had gripped her, drawn her toward a darkness that felt both external and personal. The toys, the handwriting, the silence. They whispered to her, beckoning her closer to the moment where the past and present collided. When midnight came, The city was silent, its streets glazed in frost. She moved through the shadows with a flashlight and a small hammer, the distant sound of wind whispering between the ruins. The building stood like a mausoleum, half devoured by time. She slipped inside through a gap in the fencing, her footsteps muffled on the cold ground. Inside, the air smelled of brick dust and memory. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked wall. It seemed different now, as though aware of her return. Waiting, she approached the cavity and knelt once more, feeling the coarse texture of the brick. She hesitated, then struck lightly with the hammer. The sound was hollow again, unmistakable. She struck once more, harder this time, and the inner brick gave way with a faint crumble. Dust spilled into her lap. She coughed, waved it aside, and peered inside. What she saw made her heart stop. It wasn't empty, but what was inside would take time to describe. The kind of truth that doesn't reveal itself all at once, but slowly, deliberately, like something alive beneath the surface of the world. If you've been drawn this far into the dark with me, don't look away now. The deeper we go, the closer we get to the truth that waited 80 years to be heard. Subscribe, stay close, and keep the light on. You'll need it. The hammer slipped from her hand, striking the floor with a dull clang that echoed through the skeletal building. Dust drifted through the beam of her flashlight, suspended like gray snow, refusing to settle. Her heart pounded in her ears as she stared into the hole she had opened. A narrow space behind the inner layer of bricks, darker than the night itself. She leaned closer, squinting past the dust. The beam trembled slightly as her hand shook, but the light caught something faintly reflective deep inside. Not bone, not metal. Something else. Something she didn't understand. She took a deep breath and reached inside, fingers brushing against the cold surface. It was smooth, slightly curved, brittle with age. When she pulled it out, it came with a hiss of dislodged dust. It was a glass jar, sealed with wax. Inside, beneath a thin layer of grime, was a folded scrap of paper and what appeared to be a single button, identical to the kind used for the doll's eyes. The historian's throat went dry. She turned the jar slowly in her hands, the beam catching the faint outline of words on the folded paper inside. But the glass was too fogged to read. She set the flashlight down, pulled a small pocket knife from her bag, and began scraping gently at the hardened wax around the lid. The seal broke, with a brittle snap. A faint hiss of air escaped, air trapped since 1943, carrying with it a scent so faint, yet unmistakable that it froze her blood. Smoke. Burnt cloth. She gagged slightly, forcing herself to steady her breath as she pulled the paper free with delicate care. The button fell onto the concrete, rolling toward the cavity where the toys had once been. She barely noticed. The paper, yellowed and fragile, contained words written in a trembling hand. It wasn't a child's writing. It was older, firmer, rushed. A woman's. She unfolded it carefully, revealing 3 short lines written in faded ink. If you find this, please tell them we tried to save them. They are behind the second wall. Do not break it unless you are ready to see. Her hands began to tremble violently behind the second wall. Her eyes darted toward the hollow she had just opened, to the seam of bricks still visible inside. The message wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. She turned the paper over, but there was nothing else. Just a smudge of soot at the edge, like a fingerprint burned into time. The sound of the wind outside rose suddenly, rattling loose glass and stirring a faint whisper through the hall. The historian froze, listening. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like something shifting. Faint, distant, rhythmic. A drip or a tap from somewhere inside the wall. She swallowed hard and lifted the flashlight again, shining it deep into the cavity. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, the faintest impression of something soft, fluttering like fabric. She blinked, and it was gone. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. She stepped back, pressing a hand to her chest, trying to ground herself. Rationality whispered that it was just air, just the building settling. But another voice, quieter, deeper, whispered that the air inside had been undisturbed for 80 years. Nothing should be moving. Her instinct screamed to leave, to call the authorities, to turn away from whatever truth the wall concealed. But her curiosity, or perhaps her obsession, held her in place. She turned back to the wall and reached inside again, running her hand along the seam where the inner bricks met the original structure. The surface felt uneven, slightly concave in places, as though parts of it had been set hastily. Her fingers brushed across something rough, fabric petrified by time. She recoiled, heart pounding, staring into the darkness she couldn't quite see. She whispered to herself, almost pleading, "No, it can't be." Her flashlight flickered once, twice, then steadied. She directed the beam inside again, forcing herself to look closer. The light caught what her hand had felt. A piece of cloth wedged between the bricks, faded blue, the color of a child's dress, frozen beneath decades of dust. She stared at it, her breath shallow. Then, without fully realizing what she was doing, she lifted the hammer again and struck at the seam. One blow, then another. The bricks shuddered. A crack zigzagged upward, releasing a puff of stale air that carried a faint, metallic tang. She hit it again, harder this time, the echo filling the hollow building like a heartbeat. On the fifth strike, the wall gave way. The flashlight beam wavered as the bricks tumbled forward, revealing a narrow void just large enough for a small body. The dust swirled like ash, and in that space, curled and silent, lay 3 small shapes pressed together. Shapes that had once been children. The historian stumbled backward, her hand over her mouth. The sight was too much to take in all at once. Time had reduced them to fragile outlines, bones tangled in what remained of their clothes, their hands entwined as if they had fallen asleep, holding on to each other. She dropped to her knees, shaking. The truth was worse than she had imagined, yet it carried a terrible clarity. The toys hadn't been mementos of loss. They had been companions in hiding. The mother hadn't buried them as relics. She had sealed them in with her children, believing she was saving them. They are behind the second wall. Do not break it unless you are ready to see. The warning wasn't superstition. It was grief, preserved in brick and silence. For a long time, she couldn't move. The only sound was the faint rattle of her breath and the low groan of the old building in the wind. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and looked closer at the small forms. The eldest, Lydia, she guessed, was positioned nearest the opening, her head turned slightly toward where the toys had once been. Her hands still clutched something, a scrap of paper, stiff with age. The historian hesitated, then reached forward and carefully pried it loose. It was a torn page from the same notebook they had found earlier. The graphite writing was smudged, but still legible under the beam of her light. Mother said to be brave. We can hear them outside. Emile is scared. I told him to close his eyes. She said not to make a sound. It's dark, but I can still feel her hand through the wall. The last line trailed off into a faint scribble that looked almost like a heartbeat turned into language. Beneath it, another faint mark appeared, written by an older hand, perhaps the mother's. "Forgive me." Tears blurred her vision. The historian set the note down, unable to breathe through the weight of the revelation. The past wasn't abstract anymore. It was physical, tangible, unbearably real. She realized that in her hands lay not just evidence of history, but the final moments of a family's hope. The wall hadn't just been a tomb. It had been a promise that safety existed somewhere, even if it was only on the other side of stone. She didn't hear the footsteps immediately. It wasn't until the beam of another flashlight swept across the rubble that she turned sharply, heart leaping. A voice called her name. It was one of the officers who had been assigned to guard the site, his face pale with confusion and anger. "What the hell are you doing here?" he shouted, stepping closer, and then he saw what lay inside the wall. His voice caught in his throat. "My God." The silence that followed stretched impossibly long. Then, in a whisper, he said, "We need to call this in." But before he could move, the building groaned again. A deep, visceral sound like something ancient waking. Dust rained from the ceiling. The historian stood, stumbling back as cracks spiderwebbed across the floor. The officer grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the wall. "It's not stable. We need to go." She resisted for a moment, eyes fixed on the remains, unwilling to leave them behind. But another groan shook the structure, louder this time, and she finally let him drag her toward the exit. Behind them, part of the wall collapsed inward with a crash that sent a wave of dust through the room, snuffing out her flashlight. They burst into the night air, coughing, covered in dust. Emergency lights flickered from the street as police vehicles converged on the site. The historian clutched the glass jar and the note to her chest, unable to speak. The officer radioed for backup, his voice trembling as he described what they had found. Within minutes, the site was swarmed. Police, forensic teams, journalists who had caught the scent of a headline far darker than they had imagined. When the first forensic team entered the building at dawn, they found what she had seen. The wall was half collapsed, revealing the small chamber within. The remains of 3 children were recovered with the care of archaeologists, not detectives. The air inside still carried the faint warmth of history, as if it had only just exhaled after holding its breath for 80 years. The discovery confirmed everything. The Sokolov children had not been taken. They had been hidden by their mother to save them from deportation, sealed alive inside the wall when the soldiers came. No one had ever returned to free them. The house had stood over their resting place for decades, a silent monument to love and desperation. The historian watched from the street as the bodies were carried out in small, covered stretchers. Snow fell again, quietly, like ash. Around her, reporters whispered into microphones, spinning the story into something half factual, half myth. She didn't hear them. Her eyes were fixed on the wall, or what was left of it. She thought of Lydia's last words, of the mother's note, of the toys that had waited so patiently for discovery. She realized, with a sudden weight in her chest, that history had never been silent. It had simply been waiting for someone to listen. Later, in the stillness of her office, she examined the items recovered from the wall: the notebook, the jar, the button, the letter. Each one radiated a strange energy, as though imbued with the sorrow of those who had once touched them. As she arranged them carefully on her desk, She felt the same chill she had sensed inside the building. Not malevolence exactly. Something deeper, a lingering presence. The sense that some part of the story remained unfinished. The wind outside moaned softly against the window, carrying with it the faint rhythm of something she could almost mistake for laughter. Or crying. She turned to the notebook one last time and read the final entry aloud, her voice barely more than a whisper. Mother said to be brave. The words trembled in the air like a candle's flame. She closed the notebook and sat in silence, tears sliding down her cheeks. And though she was alone, she could swear she felt a warmth behind her, a gentle pressure, the kind a mother's hand might leave on a child's shoulder. If the weight of this story found you too, if its echoes followed you past the end of this night, remember to keep the light with you and subscribe so the next descent into the dark doesn't find you unprepared. Because what's waiting beyond this truth is even deeper, and not everything that sleeps beneath the ruins wants to stay forgotten. In the days that followed the discovery, the city seemed to breathe differently. Streets that had always been noisy felt subdued, as though an invisible curtain had been drawn over the world. The demolition site was cordoned off completely now, sealed behind metal fencing and guarded around the clock. Investigators worked quietly, their movements reverent, almost ritualistic. They weren't just handling evidence. They were disturbing something sacred. The story had spread far beyond the city. International news outlets ran segments about the Wall of the Lost Children. Historians debated the details on talk shows. Forensic experts analyzed the photographs, and conspiracy theorists filled the digital void with speculations that blurred the line between history and horror. Some claimed the wall had been part of a larger network of hiding places for families fleeing persecution. Others whispered that the discovery had awakened something that had never been meant to resurface. But beneath all the noise, the truth remained fragile and quiet. 3 children who had died in darkness while believing they were safe. The historian, the one who had broken through the wall, had become both a witness and a suspect in the story's unfolding. Reporters followed her through the streets, thrusting microphones in her face, asking how it felt to unearth the dead. She said nothing. She had stopped sleeping, stopped eating. The images of the small forms behind the bricks returned to her each night when she closed her eyes. She would wake up gasping, certain she could hear soft tapping, not from outside, but from within the walls of her apartment. She told herself it was stress, that the mind plays cruel tricks when confronted with trauma. But one night, as she sat at her desk, surrounded by the recovered objects, the doll's button, the jar, the torn notebook, the tapping came again, slow and deliberate. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more, always in the same rhythm. She stared at the wall in front of her until dawn, her hands trembling, telling herself over and over that there was no one there, that she had brought only history home, not what still lived inside it. On the 3rd morning after the discovery, she received a letter delivered by hand. The envelope was yellowed, though the ink on the address was new. There was no return name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The handwriting was neat, elegant, written with a fountain pen. There are others. The building was one of many. Look for the mark beneath the plaster. It's always the same. A circle with a line through it. They used it to remember where they hid them. No signature, no explanation. She read the note 3 times before she could even process the words. Others? Other buildings? Other walls? The thought made her stomach twist. She turned the paper over, but there was nothing else. no clue to the sender's identity. She wondered if it was a cruel hoax, the kind people play when tragedy becomes public fascination. But deep down, something in her believed it. The way the note described the mark felt too specific to be invention. That night she returned to the site. This time she didn't enter the building. The authorities had reinforced it and stationed guards outside. Instead she walked around the perimeter, flashlight in hand, studying the remaining outer walls. And then on the far side of the structure, the side no camera had yet captured, she saw it. Half hidden beneath a layer of flaking plaster, faint but unmistakable, was a small circle crossed by a single vertical line. Her breath caught. The symbol was almost invisible under the decay, drawn in something that might once have been chalk or paint. She touched it with her fingertip, and a fragment of plaster fell away, revealing more of the mark. The texture beneath it felt wrong, softer than the surrounding wall, as if the plaster there had been replaced, patched up. A repair, perhaps, or a cover-up. She felt her pulse quicken. For a long time, she stood staring at that mark, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. She knew she should report it, but she also knew what would happen if she did. Bureaucracy, delays, permissions. The truth would be buried under paperwork, just as it had once been buried behind bricks. So she did what she always did. She documented it quietly, took photographs, made notes, and left. The next morning, the police received an anonymous call reporting vandalism at the site. When they arrived, they found the symbol partially exposed, and the historian's footprints in the mud nearby. They didn't arrest her, but the message was clear. Stay away. Still, she couldn't. She began to research the symbol in archives, scanning old construction records, wartime documents, blueprints. Days turned into weeks. She found fragments, references in municipal plans from 1941, architectural codes from when the city's basements were converted into shelters. But the circle with line symbol didn't appear in any official context. Then, in a forgotten file tucked into the city archive, she found a note scrawled by hand in the margin of an old police report. The handwriting was faint but legible. Marked houses for transport, children hidden separately. Her stomach clenched. She read it again and again, the meaning sinking deeper each time. The symbol wasn't random. It had been a marker, a signal left by those who hid the children, maybe even by the parents themselves, or by those who betrayed them. That night, she couldn't shake the thought that there were more walls like the one she had opened, more rooms sealed in fear and silence. The question wasn't whether they existed, it was whether they should ever be found. The following week, while reviewing old maps of the district, she noticed something strange. Several of the oldest residential buildings, dating from the same era, had suffered identical structural issues. Cracks along their western walls, the same direction, the same pattern, as if the earth itself was rejecting what it had been forced to hold. She visited one of those buildings, an abandoned tenement scheduled for demolition. The front door hung off its hinges, the interior swallowed by shadow. She moved through it with the cautious reverence of someone entering a graveyard. Dust coated everything. Wallpaper peeled in strips like skin, and there, beneath the faint glow of her flashlight, she saw it again. The circle with a line through it, drawn near the baseboard, small enough that you'd miss it unless you were looking. She knelt, tracing the mark with a gloved hand. The plaster beneath felt uneven, the same hollow echo when she tapped it. Her breath grew shallow. Then came the sound, faint, almost imperceptible, the soft hum of air moving through stone. It was coming from behind the wall. She froze, every nerve in her body tightening. She pressed her ear against the plaster, listening. There was a rhythm to it, slow, steady, like breathing. She stepped back, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. She told herself it was wind, air passing through cracks. But deep down, she knew the air in these places didn't move freely. It was trapped, heavy, waiting. She left that building and never told anyone what she heard. But in the days that followed, the sound seemed to follow her. At night, when she lay in bed, she could swear she heard the faint rhythm again, not from outside her apartment, but from inside the walls, the same steady, fragile cadence. Her reflection in the mirror grew paler each morning, her eyes darker. People around her began to notice. Colleagues whispered that she looked unwell, that she should take time off. She smiled politely, nodded, and said she was fine. But she wasn't. The truth was consuming her, pulling her deeper into the cold corridors of a past that refused to end. Then came the phone call. No number displayed, only static at first. And then a woman's voice. Soft, faint, distorted as though coming from far away. "You found them," it said. "Don't stop now." The historian froze. "Who is this?" she whispered. Silence. Then the same voice, quieter. "They're still waiting." The line went dead. She stared at the phone for a long time, her hands trembling. Every logical part of her mind screamed that it was a prank, someone exploiting her story. But her heart, or whatever part of her still felt connected to the wall, to the children, told her it wasn't. Over the next few nights, she began dreaming of the wall, not as it was when she found it, but as it must have been in 1943. The bricks fresh, the mortar wet, a candle flickering in the darkness as a mother whispered promises through the gaps. Sometimes she saw the children's faces, other times only their hands, pressed against the inside of the wall as though trying to touch the world one last time. She would wake in the dark, tears on her face, the faint smell of smoke in her room. The world outside moved on, as it always does. The media lost interest. The site was officially declared a memorial. The toys were placed in a museum exhibit titled Echoes of Silence. People came, looked, wept, and left. But for the historian, the story hadn't ended. It couldn't. She kept returning to that single phrase from the letter. There are others. She began marking a map on her wall, red pins for every building constructed before 1944 that had since shown cracks or collapse along its western side. There were 11 potential sites, 11 possible walls. The thought made her dizzy. She sat in front of the map for hours, staring at the constellation of red dots, like a code she couldn't quite decipher. One night, as she studied the map in the dim light, the room suddenly grew colder. Her breath fogged in the air. The papers on her desk rustled through the window was closed. Then faintly, she heard it again. That slow, rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Her eyes drifted toward the wall beside her desk, where the shadows deepened in the corners. She whispered, "Lydia," and the sound stopped. The silence that followed was alive, heavy, a presence in the air. She rose slowly, every muscle trembling, and reached out toward the wall. Her fingertips touched the paint. The surface was cold, but beneath that cold, she could swear she felt warmth. A pulse, faint but steady. She withdrew her hand as tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." The air shifted. Somewhere far away, A clock struck 3 times, the same rhythm that had haunted her nights. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and endless, covering the city in a white silence that felt almost merciful. But beneath that silence, in the bones of the buildings that still stood from the war, something was stirring, something that had waited too long to be remembered. The historian didn't know it yet, but the discovery of the Sokolov children had only been the first crack in a wall that spanned more than one building, more than one lifetime. And as the city slept beneath its thin blanket of snow, the walls were beginning to breathe again. If you can still hear the echoes of their story, if you feel the weight of what's waiting behind the next wall, make sure you subscribe, because this darkness is spreading, and the next sound you hear in the quiet of your home might not be the wind. Winter held the city in its teeth. By late December, the snow had thickened, swallowing streets, softening corners, quieting everything. The historian moved through the cold like a ghost herself. Her coat, heavy with frost, her breath fogging in front of her as she walked through the maze of narrow streets that had once been the heart of the old district. She had stopped answering calls. She rarely ate. Her colleagues at the museum had begun whispering about her obsession, about how she had changed since the wall. Her eyes, they said, looked wrong now, too alert, too haunted, as though they no longer saw only the present. She didn't care. Every night she returned to her map, the constellation of red pins glowing faintly under the lamplight. 11 buildings marked, 11 possibilities. She had investigated 2 of them in secret. Both bore the same faint symbol, the circle with a line, hidden beneath layers of plaster and neglect. In one, she found nothing but hollow walls. In another, she heard the same soft hum of air, that faint whisper of something trapped behind stone. She hadn't dared to open it, not yet. The letter's warning replayed in her mind endlessly. They used it to remember where they hid them. The word they had begun to consume her thoughts. Who were they? Parents? Neighbors? Resistance members? Or something else entirely? A collective of the desperate, sealing children away from a world that wanted to erase them. The historian's nights became fragmented, filled with half-dreams of candle-lit basements, mothers whispering lullabies in the dark, bricks being laid with trembling hands, and always, always, that voice in her dreams, soft and close. Don't stop now. One evening she found herself walking toward the outskirts of the city, where the old industrial quarter stood abandoned, its buildings blackened with soot and time. One of her pins marked a structure there, a textile factory built in 1939, decommissioned after the war. She had uncovered records linking it to wartime deportations. It had once served as a temporary holding facility. But the blueprints suggested something stranger. A series of small windowless rooms built into the walls themselves, too small to be storage, too narrow for function. She reached the factory just as the light was dying, the sun bleeding out over the horizon. The main doors were chained shut, but a side entrance had rotted open. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp fabric and rust. Her flashlight swept across old machinery, its metal bones dusted in frost. She moved slowly, listening to the hollow echo of her footsteps. Every sound in the place felt amplified. The creak of wood, the distant drip of water, the faint flutter of rats retreating into shadow. The deeper she went, the colder it grew. Her breath came out in pale ribbons. She found the corridor marked on the blueprint, narrow, low-ceilinged, lined with rusted hooks. At the far end stood a wall covered in cracked plaster, and there, barely visible beneath the decay, she saw it again. The circle, and the line, the same mark. Her pulse quickened. She approached slowly, running her fingers along the wall. The plaster felt soft, brittle, like dried skin. She pressed her ear against it. At first, nothing. Then, faintly, the same sound she had heard before. A slow, rhythmic tapping. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Her body went rigid. The sound was coming from inside the wall. She staggered back, her flashlight trembling. "No," she whispered. "No, that's not possible." The sound stopped abruptly, as if the thing inside had heard her. She stood in silence, every nerve burning. Then the noise began again, softer this time, more irregular, not knocks, but something that almost sounded like breathing. She pressed her back to the opposite wall, fighting the urge to run. Rational thought battled panic. It could be air, she told herself. Pipes, echoes. But deep down, she knew the difference. She knew what air sounded like, what echo felt like. This was neither. This was presence. Her flashlight flickered once, then again. The beam dimmed, pulsed weakly, and died. Darkness consumed the corridor. She fumbled for the spare batteries in her coat, her hands shaking. As she did, the sound came again. Closer now, a scrape, faint but deliberate, as though something was moving against the inner surface of the wall. She froze, unable to breathe. And then in the dark, a whisper, so quiet she almost thought she imagined it. A child's voice. "Help us!" the historian screamed. The batteries fell from her hand, clattering to the floor. She stumbled backward, her shoulder striking a rusted pipe. Pain jolted her, but it didn't matter. The whisper came again, clearer now, echoing faintly through the dark. "Help us!" Her mind fractured under the sound. She bolted down the corridor, tripping over debris, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin. The cold followed her like a shadow. She didn't stop until she burst out into the night, falling to her knees in the snow outside the factory. Her hands shook uncontrollably. The silence that followed was unbearable, vast and hollow, and filled with the weight of what she had heard. When she returned home that night, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark, her coat still dusted with snow, listening. The city outside was quiet, but inside her apartment she could hear it again. Faint, rhythmic, the sound of something tapping softly behind the wall. She pressed her palms to her ears and began to sob. Days passed in a blur. She avoided the museum, ignored the calls, left meals untouched. Her colleagues filed a missing persons report, but when the police came to check her apartment, she answered the door pale and trembling, insisting she was fine. They didn't believe her, but they left. She locked the door behind them and leaned against it, shaking. That night, she began writing. Not research, not reports. Confessions. Her journal filled with frantic handwriting. There are more walls. I can hear them, the children. They never stopped calling. I think they know me now. I think they remember who found them. When I close my eyes, I see their hands through the bricks. Lydia is always closest. She whispers my name. Her handwriting grew uneven, desperate. On one page, a line appeared underlined 3 times. The walls are connected. She wasn't sure what she meant, only that it felt true. Every marked building, every crack, every breath of cold air seemed linked, as if the city itself had become one vast tomb, pulsing faintly with the memory of what it had swallowed. One evening she awoke from a brief, restless sleep to the sound of something moving in her living room. She froze, in bed, listening. A soft scrape, then another. She reached for her flashlight, heart pounding. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing her desk. The notebook from the Sokolov wall lay open, though she was certain she had closed it. The last page, once blank, now bore new writing. Faint, written in graphite, identical to the child's. You opened one. You must open the rest. She dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, throwing wild shadows against the walls. The writing couldn't be real. The notebook had been sealed in a glass case at the museum. It couldn't be here, yet it was. The same paper, the same tear along the edge, the same faint scent of smoke. She backed away, trembling, whispering, "This isn't happening." The air grew colder. A breath, not hers, fogged in front of her. "Help us!" Her scream echoed through the apartment, but no one came. By morning, she was gone. The next day, her door was found ajar. Her apartment was undisturbed, except for one thing. The wall beside her desk had been broken open. The plaster lay in chunks on the floor. Inside the cavity, investigators found her flashlight, still faintly glowing, and pressed into the dust beside it. Small, indistinct handprints. No one could explain how they were so small. The police closed the case quickly, filing it as a psychological breakdown and disappearance. The museum shut down the Echoes of Silence exhibit, citing security concerns. The artifacts, the toys, the notebook, the letter, were placed in storage. The city moved on, as it always does, but among those who had worked the case, there were whispers that refused to die. One of the officers who'd been on site swore he could still hear the tapping whenever he passed the museum's basement. Another claimed he'd seen small shadows moving in the reflection of the glass display where the toys had once been. None of them reported it officially, but they all stopped taking night shifts. The winter eventually broke, giving way to spring. The snow melted, the city thawed, but beneath the new warmth, the old walls remained. And when the demolition crews resumed their work, tearing down one of the condemned buildings marked on the historian's map, they stopped mid-swing, because inside the wall, beneath the first layer of bricks, they found something else. Not toys this time. Letters, dozens of them, sealed in wax, addressed to no one. Each bore the same date, March 3rd, 1943. Each written in the same trembling hand. The first began simply, "If someone finds this, please know we tried." The letters were still being catalogued when strange things began to happen at the storage facility. Lights flickered, alarms triggered without reason. Security cameras caught flashes of movement. Small, fast, close to the ground. One night, a guard reported hearing a child's laughter echoing from inside one of the crates. When he opened it, there was nothing but dust. The following morning, his shift partner found him sitting in the corner of the room, pale and unresponsive, whispering over and over, "They're behind the wall. Don't open it." And somewhere in the city, perhaps in a building no one had marked yet, a single hairline crack began to form in a forgotten brick wall. So small, it might have gone unnoticed. But those who know the sound, those who've heard it before, would recognize it instantly. The faint, hollow sound of a wall beginning to breathe. If you've followed this far into the dark, keep the light close. And subscribe. Because what's waiting in the final part of this story is not about discovery anymore. It's about what happens when the walls decide to remember you.